The air inside the packed courtroom was thick with tension, an almost tangible weight pressing down on the crowd as hushed whispers flickered like embers through the room. Journalists clutched their notepads, eager to capture every detail, while victims sat rigidly in the front rows, their eyes locked onto the man at the defendant's table. This was not just another trial. It was the reckoning of Ethan Grayson, the billionaire financier whose name had once been synonymous with power, now reduced to a symbol of greed and betrayal. When the courtroom doors swung open, the murmurs intensified. Grayson entered, his towering frame wrapped in an immaculately tailored charcoal suit, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. His presence exuded confidence, no arrogance. He smirked at the crowd as if they were beneath him, as if they had all gathered here today for his benefit rather than his judgment. The man who had stolen millions, shattered lives, and ruined futures walked in like he still owned the room. But if Grayson was the embodiment of unchecked privilege, then Judge Monica Lee was the force that would remind him that wealth did not make him untouchable. As she strode toward the bench, clad in her flowing black robe, there was no need for grand gestures or raised voices. Her authority was absolute, carried in the sharpness of her gaze, the unwavering precision of her steps. She was a woman who had spent her career ensuring that justice was not a privilege reserved for the powerful, and today would be no different. All rise for the Honorable Judge Monica Lee. The bailiff's voice rang out, prompting a wave of movement as everyone stood in unison. Everyone, except Ethan Grayson. A charged silence filled the room. The air grew heavier, pressing against the walls as eyes darted between the judge and the defendant, who remained seated, idly flipping through a legal pad as though the proceedings were nothing more than an inconvenience. His attorney leaned in, whispering urgently, but Grayson merely waved him off with a flick of his wrist. Judge Lee did not react, not yet. But the shift in the courtroom was undeniable. The quiet was no longer just silence. It was expectation. It was challenge. It was the slow realization that Ethan Grayson was about to learn a lesson no amount of money could buy. And this was only the beginning. Ethan Grayson wasn't just wealthy. He was the kind of rich that turned heads, the kind that made people whisper his name in admiration or envy. He moved through the world with an air of invincibility, draped in tailored suits that cost more than most people's annual rent, his wrist adorned with a watch worth more than a family car. He had mansions on both coasts, private jets at his disposal, and an empire built on the illusion of brilliance. But the truth about Ethan Grayson's wealth was far less glamorous. His company, Grayson Investments, had once been hailed as the pinnacle of financial success, a firm that promised to turn middle-class dreams into reality. He marketed himself as a self-made visionary, a man who had cracked the code of financial prosperity and was willing to share the secret. Investors poured in their savings, entrusting him with their futures, believing in the gleaming skyscrapers that bore his name, the lavish events where he spoke of limitless possibilities. But behind closed doors, behind the polished veneer of success, lay a foundation built on deception. Ethan didn't make his fortune through savvy investments or groundbreaking strategies. He made it by selling a fantasy, by weaving a narrative so compelling that people were willing to gamble everything they had. He promised stability to families, security to retirees, and wealth to young entrepreneurs eager to build their futures. But in reality, it was a carefully crafted illusion, a pyramid that stood tall only because it was constantly fed by new investors. For years, his schemes worked. He knew how to play the system, how to manipulate numbers, and how to silence those who asked too many questions. When returns started to slow, he fabricated statements, making investors believe their money was growing while he funneled millions into his personal accounts. While single mothers struggled to put food on the table, while retirees wondered how they would afford their medications, Ethan was sipping champagne on his yacht, hosting lavish parties with celebrities who saw him as nothing more than a generous benefactor. And the worst part, he didn't care. When whispers of fraud began to surface, Ethan brushed them off with ease. He had the best lawyers money could buy, advisors who knew how to make problems disappear. He believed he was untouchable, that as long as he kept up appearances, as long as he maintained the illusion, no one would dare challenge him. But illusions don't last forever. Investigators started connecting the dots, and what they found was undeniable. Fake bank records, doctored financial reports, and testimonies from former employees who had been forced to participate in his deception. The evidence was overwhelming, but even as the walls began to close in, Ethan remained defiant. "This will blow over," he had told reporters outside his Malibu estate, flashing the same arrogant smirk that had charmed investors for years. "It always does. But this time it wouldn't. Because the people he had stolen from weren't just numbers on a screen. They were real, and they were angry. Families had lost everything, their savings wiped out overnight. Parents who had spent decades working for a secure retirement were now left with nothing. Young couples who had trusted Grayson Investments with their first major investments were now drowning in debt. And now, they wanted justice. By the time the trial was announced, the courtroom became a battleground, a place where the victims of Ethan Grayson's greed would finally have their voices heard. The illusion he had so carefully maintained was about to be shattered, and for the first time in his life, Ethan Grayson would have to face something he had always believed he was above: consequences. Little did he know, the judge presiding over his case had no patience for men like him. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, the air thick with anticipation. The trial of Ethan Grayson wasn't just another high-profile case, it was an event, a spectacle that had captured the nation's attention. The man who once sat atop the financial world, who had charmed his way into the trust of thousands, now stood on trial, facing the very people whose lives he had shattered. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and Ethan strode in with the same confidence that had carried him through years of deception. He wasn't dressed like a man facing decades behind bars. His charcoal gray designer suit was flawless, his hair slicked back with precision. To the world he had fallen, but in his mind, he was still standing tall. As he walked past rows of onlookers, whispers followed him like shadows. Victims, journalists, and curious spectators murmured among themselves, their voices a mixture of outrage and disbelief. How could he still look so unaffected? How could a man responsible for so much devastation wear that same smug grin? Ethan reached his seat at the defense table and sat down with deliberate ease. He leaned back in his chair, crossed one leg over the other, and drummed his fingers lightly on the polished wood. His posture wasn't that of a man desperate to prove his innocence. It was that of someone who believed this was all just an inconvenience, a temporary disruption in his otherwise charmed life. Then, the door behind the bench opened, and Judge Monica Lee entered. The bailiff's voice rang through the room. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Monica Lee." The entire courtroom stood in unison. Everyone, except Ethan Grayson. Gasps rippled through the room as eyes turned toward him. He remained seated, casually flipping through a legal pad as if the proceedings were beneath his notice. His attorney whispered something urgent in his ear, but Ethan waved him off with a flick of his wrist. Judge Lee paused at the bench, her sharp gaze locking onto Ethan. Her reputation preceded her. Known for her no-nonsense approach, she was a judge who valued justice over theatrics, one who had seen every kind of defendant walk through her courtroom. But even she was momentarily taken aback by the sheer audacity before her. "You may be seated," she said, her voice even but firm. The weight in the air shifted. The message was clear. She had seen the disrespect, noted it, but chose not to address it yet. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn Carter, wasted no time. She stood, adjusting the cuffs of her suit, and stepped forward with controlled precision. "Your Honor," she began, turning toward the jury. "Today, we stand in a courtroom filled with victims, with people whose lives have been upended by the actions of one man. Ethan Grayson did not simply make bad business decisions. He orchestrated a calculated, deliberate scheme to steal millions from hardworking families." As she spoke, the faces of those who had suffered at Ethan's hands filled the rows behind her. Angela Martinez sat with her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the man who had stolen everything from her family. Beside her, Peter Vaughn, the retired firefighter who had lost his life savings, stared at Ethan with quiet, simmering anger. And yet, Ethan looked unimpressed. He glanced at his nails, barely listening, as though he had heard this all before. Evelyn Carter didn't miss a beat. She turned toward the defendant's table. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice cutting through the air, "you sit here today accused of fraud, conspiracy, and theft. Do you have anything to say to the people whose lives you destroyed?" Ethan leaned forward, finally acknowledging her presence. He tilted his head slightly, that ever-present smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "I think you're all making this far more dramatic than it needs to be," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Business is business. People take risks. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose." A stunned silence followed. A murmur of disbelief spread through the gallery, and Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Judge Lee, however, had heard enough. She adjusted her glasses and folded her hands in front of her. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice measured but unyielding, "this is not a corporate boardroom. This is a court of law. And I strongly suggest that you start taking these proceedings seriously." Ethan chuckled under his breath but said nothing. But Judge Monica Lee had already made up her mind. Ethan Grayson may have walked into that courtroom believing himself untouchable, but he was about to learn that wealth and arrogance were no match for justice. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Ethan Grayson, still lounging in his seat as if he were watching a mundane presentation, seemed oblivious to the shifting atmosphere around him. His arrogance had set the tone from the beginning, but now the trial was about to take a turn he never saw coming. Prosecutor Evelyn Carter stood tall, a folder in her hands. Her eyes, sharp as steel, locked onto Ethan. "Your Honor," she began, walking toward the jury, "we have spent the past few days establishing the devastation caused by Ethan Grayson's fraudulent schemes. But today, we present evidence so undeniable, so damning, that not even the defendant himself will be able to talk his way out of it." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Reporters tightened their grips on their pens. Victims leaned forward in their seats, desperate for justice. Even Judge Monica Lee, who had remained composed throughout the proceedings, seemed to sense that this was the moment everything would change. Evelyn turned toward the large screen behind her. "Mr. Grayson, do you recall an email you sent to your executive team on March 14th of last year?" Ethan smirked. "I send a lot of emails, Miss Carter. Be more specific." Her lips curled in a knowing smile. "Of course, let me refresh your memory." She clicked a remote, and the screen behind her lit up with a magnified email thread. Gasps filled the room as the words appeared in bold, undeniable clarity. "Make the numbers look good. We need these suckers to sign before they start asking too many questions." A beat of silence. Then, a stunned ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Angela Martinez pressed a hand over her mouth, her face a mixture of shock and fury. Peter Vaughn clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening into fists. The words on the screen weren't just careless, they were cruel. A direct confirmation that Ethan had seen his victims as nothing more than pawns in his game of wealth. Ethan leaned forward, his smirk faltering. "This is out of context," he said, waving a dismissive hand. Evelyn didn't blink. "Out of context? Let's see what else you had to say." She clicked again. Another email. "Delay the payouts. If they get too loud, offer them a small return to keep them quiet." Most of them are too desperate to push back. The courtroom erupted. The judge's gavel struck the wood, demanding order, but the damage was done. Ethan Grayson had just buried himself. His lawyer scrambled to his feet. "Objection. These emails do not prove direct criminal intent." Judge Lee lifted a hand, silencing him. Overruled. Her eyes, steady and unyielding, fell on Ethan. "Mr. Grayson, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Ethan's lips parted, but for the first time in his life, words failed him. He glanced at his lawyer, searching for a lifeline, but found none. Evelyn Carter stepped forward. "Your Honor, the prosecution has just one more piece of evidence to present." She clicked again. The screen now played a video recording security footage from Grayson Investments headquarters. In the grainy black and white footage, Ethan stood in his office, leaning over his desk, speaking to an unseen subordinate. The audio crackled to life. "By the time they realize what's happening, we'll be in the clear. These people are nobodies. Who's going to fight me? The courts?" A collective gasp. Ethan paled. Judge Monica Lee set down her pen, her fingers laced together. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence, "you just answered your own question." The weight of Ethan Grayson's arrogance had finally caught up to him. The courtroom, once a place where he believed his wealth and influence would protect him, had become his downfall. The evidence had been laid bare, his own words sealing his fate. But the moment that would define this trial, the moment that would leave an indelible mark on everyone in that room, belonged to Judge Monica Lee. She sat in silence for a long moment, letting the final echoes of the damning video fade. The tension in the room was suffocating, every person waiting for her response. Ethan Grayson, for once, looked uneasy. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but he barely reacted. The realization had begun to sink in this time. There would be no escaping accountability. Judge Lee exhaled slowly before she spoke. "Mr. Grayson," she began, her voice steady but weighted with authority. "Throughout this trial, you have treated these proceedings with blatant disrespect. You have rolled your eyes at witnesses, dismissed the suffering of your victims, and conducted yourself with an arrogance that suggests you believe you are above the law." Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a flicker of his old defiance still lingering. Judge Lee's gaze sharpened. "You are not." A hush fell over the room. "You have stolen millions from hardworking people, families, retirees, small business owners, people who placed their trust in you, only to have their lives shattered by your greed." Her voice never wavered, but the weight behind each word was inescapable. "And even now, with overwhelming evidence before you, you refuse to take responsibility." Ethan scoffed, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous. You're acting like I'm some kind of villain." Judge Lee raised a hand, cutting him off. The room went silent. "Mr. Grayson, I strongly advise you to remain silent unless spoken to," she said, her tone razor-sharp. "This is not one of your board meetings. This is a court of law." The authority in her voice was absolute. Ethan's mouth clamped shut. The judge turned to the jury, her expression grave. "The law exists to protect those who cannot protect themselves from people like Mr. Grayson. It exists to ensure that power and privilege do not exempt one from justice." She let her words hang for a moment before continuing. "And justice demands consequences." The air in the room felt charged, as though the entire courtroom was holding its breath. Judge Lee reached for her gavel but hesitated, meeting Ethan's gaze one last time. "You had every opportunity to do the right thing, to show remorse, to acknowledge the pain you caused." She shook her head. "But you made your choice, and now you will live with it." Her gavel struck the wood. "I hereby sentence Ethan Grayson to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." Gasps erupted in the courtroom. A few cheers broke out, quickly stifled by the weight of the moment. Victims clutched one another, tears streaming down their faces. Peter Vaughn let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Angela Martinez pressed a trembling hand over her mouth, her body shaking with quiet sobs. Ethan, meanwhile, had gone rigid. He blinked, as if unable to process what had just happened. Judge Lee wasn't finished. "Furthermore," she continued, her tone unwavering, "I am ordering the immediate liquidation of your assets. Every dollar stolen will be returned to the victims." Ethan shot up from his seat. "You can't do that." His voice cracked with panic. "That money is mine." Judge Lee's expression remained impassive. It never was. Two bailiffs moved toward Ethan, ready to escort him out. But he wasn't done yet. "This isn't over," he bellowed, his face red with fury. "I'll appeal. I'll take this to the Supreme Court. The gavel struck the wood once more. "Remove him," Judge Lee commanded. As the bailiffs grabbed Ethan's arms, he thrashed against them, still spewing desperate threats. But no one in that room cared anymore. The power he had once wielded had vanished. The invincible billionaire was now just another criminal facing the consequences of his actions. As Ethan was dragged from the courtroom, Judge Lee turned her attention to the gallery. "Let this be a reminder," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, "that no amount of wealth or influence can place someone above the law." The crowd sat in awed silence. They had come seeking justice, and today they had found it. The moment Judge Monica Lee delivered the final sentence, the air in the courtroom turned electric. Ethan Grayson, the man who once believed himself untouchable, stood frozen in disbelief. His carefully crafted world of wealth and deception had just collapsed around him. And for the first time, he had no way out. 25 years. No parole. Immediate liquidation of his assets. The weight of those words pressed down on Ethan like a crushing force. His breathing became shallow, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. He could hear the murmurs rising around him, the hushed voices of spectators who had waited for this moment. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching against paper, capturing every detail of his downfall. Angela Martinez wiped the tears from her face, still trembling from the emotional weight of the verdict. Peter Vaughn sat back in his chair, exhaling a breath of relief, his fingers tightening into fists. Justice had been served, but for those who had suffered under Ethan's greed, this was more than a legal victory, it was a reckoning. Ethan, however, refused to accept reality. "This is insane," he hissed under his breath, his mind racing. He had spent his entire life manipulating systems, buying influence, escaping consequences. He had survived scandal before, always landing on his feet, always coming out richer. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. As the bailiffs moved toward him, Ethan's shock turned into outrage. He slammed his hands on the defendant's table, his voice rising in fury. "No, this isn't happening." His shout echoed through the courtroom. "I am Ethan Grayson. Do you hear me? You can't do this to me." Judge Lee remained unmoved. Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, held his gaze as if she had anticipated this very reaction. "You did this to yourself, Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice cutting through his outburst like a blade. Ethan turned to his lawyer, his face flushed with anger. "Do something. File an appeal. Challenge the ruling. I don't care what it takes, fix this." His attorney, who had once stood confidently by his side, now looked at him with thinly veiled contempt. He knew better than anyone that this case was over. No appeal could erase the evidence, the testimonies, or the blatant arrogance Ethan had displayed throughout the trial. Ethan's breathing grew ragged, his hands trembling. The reality was setting in. His money, his power, his influence, none of it mattered now. The bailiff stepped in, placing firm hands on his arms. He jerked away, but their grip tightened. "You can't take everything from me," he snarled, his voice breaking. "This is my life, my money. You're ruining me." Judge Lee remained calm. "No, Mr. Grayson, you did that all on your own." As Ethan was forcibly escorted toward the exit, the room erupted into murmurs. Some spectators shook their heads, marveling at the downfall of a man who had once seemed invincible. Others whispered words of satisfaction, knowing that, for once, justice had not been bought or bargained away. Angela Martinez turned to Peter Vaughn, her eyes still damp but shining with relief. "It's finally over," she whispered. Peter nodded, his expression solemn. It had to be. As the heavy courtroom doors swung open, Ethan twisted his head back one last time, his eyes wild with desperation. He had always been the one in control. He had dictated the rules, set the terms, but now he was just another convict, powerless, his name soon to be forgotten. The doors slammed shut behind him. As the heavy courtroom doors shut behind Ethan Grayson, the weight of his downfall rippled far beyond the walls of that courthouse. His conviction was more than a legal sentence, it was a symbol, a warning to every corrupt tycoon who believed they were immune to consequences. For years, Ethan had operated under the illusion that money was his shield, that wealth could erase accountability. But now, stripped of everything, he was just another criminal, no different from those he had once looked down upon. Outside the courthouse, the impact of the verdict was immediate. Reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing, eager to capture the reaction of the victims. Angela Martinez clutched her daughter's hand tightly as she faced the crowd. Her voice was steady, but the emotions beneath it were raw. "This doesn't bring back what we lost," she admitted, "but it gives us something we never thought we'd have again, justice." Peter Vaughn stood nearby, watching the chaos unfold. The man who had spent his life running into fires had nearly lost everything to a man who had never known hardship. "He thought he could buy his way out," Peter muttered, shaking his head. "Turns out the law still works for now." But the consequences for Ethan didn't end with his sentencing. His empire, once untouchable, crumbled in mere days. Banks froze his accounts, luxury properties were seized, and auction houses prepared to liquidate his assets. The lavish mansions, the private jets, the designer suits, all of it was now collateral to repay those he had wronged. The headlines, once singing praises of his business acumen, now chronicled his disgrace. Former associates distanced themselves, business partners erased his name from their ledgers, and the financial world that had once celebrated him turned its back, without hesitation. But beyond the headlines and financial ruin, Ethan Grayson faced the one thing he had never encountered before: irrelevance. The man who once commanded rooms with arrogance, who believed his name alone could bend the world to his will, was now just another case in the judicial system. In the prison where he would serve his time, there were no brand deals, no handshakes with powerful men, no manipulation of markets. He was no longer a billionaire. He was just a number. The trial of Ethan Grayson was a reckoning, but it was also a lesson. No matter how high someone rises, no matter how much power they accumulate, there is always a limit. And when that limit is crossed, the fall is not just steep, it is absolute. Ethan Grayson's story did not end with the gavel's final strike. His downfall became a cautionary tale, a reminder that no amount of wealth, power, or arrogance can outrun justice forever. His empire had crumbled, his fortune had been stripped away, and his name, once synonymous with success, was now a stain in the financial world. But the true impact of his trial was not just in his punishment, it was in the message it sent. For too long, people like Ethan had manipulated the system, exploiting loopholes, crushing lives, and walking away untouched. But this time, the outcome was different. This time, justice prevailed. It wasn't just about sending one man to prison, it was about proving that accountability is not a privilege reserved for the weak. It is a demand that even the most powerful must face. Outside the courthouse, the world moved on. Angela Martinez, Peter Vaughn, and countless others who had suffered at Ethan's hands were still rebuilding their lives. They knew they would never fully recover what had been stolen from them, but they had won something more valuable, a sense of dignity restored, a belief that the system could still work when people fought for it. Now the question remains, when faced with corruption, injustice, or abuse of power, will you speak up? Will you demand accountability? Or will you allow silence to let history repeat itself? If you believe that justice must always be served, comment 1 below. If you think there's still more to be done to fix a broken system, comment 2. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that reveal the power of truth and integrity. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.